So let's talk about focus and depth of field. Focus is basically how sharp things are in the frame, and depth of field refers to how much of your scene in your shot is in focus at one time. So if we think about focus and depth of field, we'll draw a little diagram here. So here's our camera, and looking at it from the side, and of course the first thing that we have to put in here to photograph is an apple. So we'll put that closest to the camera, but let's add a couple other things farther away from the camera. So an orange, and we can add a banana as well. That's at the farthest away from camera. And depth of field refers to how much of the scene, what kind of slice through it is in focus. So with this depth of field, the orange would be in focus, but as we get farther away or closer to the camera, things become progressively more out of focus. That is the depth of field, how deep the focus goes. Now that depth can be increased and decreased and kind of moved further and closer away from the camera by adjusting your camera. But that's what depth of field is, how much of your image is in focus. So if we look at an example, that's a really good example from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The next shot that you see has very clear depth of field. So we can see here in this shot, the thing that's closest to us, that mound of clay that's closest to us, is out of focus. The depth of field is set so that the clay model of Devil's Tower is in focus, and then behind it things are again out of focus. So the depth of field is set just for that model in the midground. Now you can also see that newspaper immediately behind the Devil's Tower model, the yellow piece of paper. You can actually see it go from more in focus to less in focus as it gets farther away from the camera, and then the table behind it is still yet further out of focus. So this is a really good look at depth of field in action in a shot. So the way that you can get more or less depth of field is by making some adjustments to some of the things we've talked about already today. To get greater depth of field, more depth of field, small aperture, so you get more things in focus by letting less light into your camera. The other thing that you could do to increase your depth of field is to use a short focal length. So a smaller focal length gives you more depth of field. And then the third thing is to actually just put your subject matter farther away from your camera. So the farther away things are from your camera, the increased depth of field. To decrease your depth of field, to give you shallow focus, a wide aperture, open it up larger to get less focus, and a longer focal length, as you might imagine, and no surprise here, get your subject matter close to the camera to get decreased depth of field. One other thing that's important in this that most people don't talk about is the size of the sensor in your camera. If you've got a smaller sensor, like on a camera like an iPhone, you're going to get greater depth of field. If you've got a bigger sensor, like on a DSLR or a professional digital cinema camera, you'll get a much shallower depth of field just by virtue of the size of your sensor.